Okay, well, I think it's 1:34, so I think we'll get started. Um, Good afternoon, everyone. This is Tom Armitage. I'm from the EPA Science Advisory Board office. I'm the designated federal officer for the EPA Science Advisory Board, and I'd like to convene this public meeting of the Chartered Science Advisory Board. I'm just going to make a few brief remarks as the DFO before we get started. The Chartered SAB is meeting virtually today by web conference to conduct a quality review of a draft report developed by an SAB panel and discuss an additional draft report developed by an SAB work group and to discuss recommendations received from another SAB work group regarding review of the science supporting planned EPA regulatory actions. So I'd first like to note that the Science Advisory Board is an independent expert federal advisory committee. It's chartered under the authority of the Federal Advisory Committee Act, or FACA, and it's empowered by law to provide scientific and technical advice to the EPA administrator. Science Advisory Board meetings and deliberations are held as public meetings that meet the requirements of the Federal Advisory Committee Act, and the discussions of the SAB and its interactions with the public and with EPA are conducted in sessions where I, as the DFO, am present to ensure that the requirements of FACA are met. FACA also requires that public meetings provide an opportunity for public comment, and we do have a public comment period on the agenda for this meeting. Members of the public who register in advance can make oral comments during a comment period. I would like to note that we have not received requests from members of the public to provide oral comments at this meeting. Members of the public may also submit written comments for consideration by the SAB, and any written comments received are posted on the SAB meeting website and are available to SAB members for consideration. I'd also like to note that the minutes of this meeting will be prepared to summarize the discussion and the action items in accordance with the requirements of FACA. The minutes will be certified by the SAB chair and posted on the SAB website. We are holding this meeting virtually using Zoom, so I want to let all the attendees know that we have also provided members of the public access to this meeting through a teleconference line and through a live webcast. And all materials being discussed are available on the SAB website. I'd like to note that the SAB consists of special government employees appointed by EPA. Board members are serving as independent scientific and technical experts and not as representatives of any group. And as government employees, SAB members are subject to applicable ethics laws and regulations. So I'd like to inform everyone that the SAB office has determined that the members participating in this meeting have no financial conflicts of interest or appearance of lack of impartiality concerning the topics on the meeting agenda today. So I'm going to take roll to note who's here from the board for the record. I'd also like to ask that any members of the public who are listening to the webcast send me an email at armitage.thomas@epa.gov to let me know you attended the meeting. And after I take roll, I'm going to be turning the meeting over to Tom Brennan, director of the SAB office, for introductory remarks, and then to our new chair, Dr. Kimberly Jones. Since this is the first meeting for some new members and for Dr. Jones, we thought it would be helpful for you to introduce yourself briefly when I call your name. Just indicate your affiliation and your position and introduce yourself. So I'm going to go through the roll now. Just please let me know if you're present and then introduce yourself. So we'll start with our new chair, Dr. Kimberly Jones.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kimberly Jones. Honored to be here. It's a pleasure to serve as your new chair. I'm Associate Provost at Howard University and also a professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering here at Howard. And I'm an environmental engineer by training. I do research in water and wastewater treatment. Great to be here.
Thank you. Dr. Marjorie Alion.
Hi, and welcome, Kimberly. I'm Marjorie Leon, also in your field, environmental engineering, University of Massachusetts Amherst in the Department of Environmental Health Sciences, and previous dean and currently professor emeritus.
Dr. David Allen.
I'm Dave Allen from the University of Texas at Austin, where I'm a professor of chemical engineering. My expertise is in air quality.
Dr. Susan Annenberg.
Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Annenberg. I'm professor and chair of environmental and occupational health at George Washington University. And my focus is on air pollution and climate change.
Dr. Florence Anuro. Dr. Joe Arvai.
Hi, everyone. I'm Joe Arvai, the director of the USC Wrigley Institute for Environment and Sustainability. I am also a professor here of psychology, biological sciences, and environmental studies. And yeah, that's about it.
Dr. Barbara Beck.
Hi, and welcome, Kimberly. Glad to have you on the Science Advisory Board. I'm Barbara Beck. I'm a toxicologist and risk assessor at Gradient, a consulting company. I've been a member of the Science Advisory Board under the prior and now under the present administration, and I work on site-specific and chemical-specific risk assessments.
Dr. Roland Benke.
Present. Roland Benke, director at Renaissance Code Development with expertise in radiation detection and risk analysis.
Thank you. Dr. Veronica Barakal.
Hi, I'm Veronica Berrocal, and I'm professor in the Department of Statistics at University of California, Irvine, and I'm a statistician with expertise in spatial statistics, environmental exposure assessment with applications to air quality and climate change.
Dr. Tammy Bond.
Hello and welcome, Dr. Jones, as our chair. I'm Tammy Bond. I'm a professor of mechanical engineering and Scott Presidential Chair in Energy and Environment and Health. My expertise has been in air quality. I've kind of moved over to air quality, climate, and systems of change with regard to technology. Thank you.
Dr. Mark Borsak.
Hi, I'm Mark Borsak. I'm a professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Duke. I'm also co-director of the Duke Center on Risk. My areas of interest and expertise are in environmental modeling, especially with a focus on uncertainty and probabilistic methods.
Dr. Sylvie Bruder.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm a professor in the Department of Agronomy at Purdue University, and I'm also the director of the Center for Global Food Security here. My area of expertise is carbon, water, and nutrient cycling in agroecosystems. My background is in ecology.
Dr. Jay Chakraborty.
Everyone, I'm Jay Chakraborty from the University of Texas at El Paso. I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology here, as well as the director of the Socio-Environmental and Geospatial Analysis Lab. And my expertise and interests focus on environmental justice, climate justice, and vulnerability to hazards and disasters.
Dr. Amin Chen.
Hi, I'm Amin Chen. I'm an environmental epidemiologist, a professor of epidemiology at the University of Pennsylvania Permanent School of Medicine. I co-direct the Philadelphia Regional Center for Children's Environmental Health. My research mostly is in heavy metals and endocrine disrupting chemicals.
Dr. Wei-Shui Chu.
Hi, I'm Wei-Shui Chu. I'm a professor here at Texas A&M University in the Department of Veterinary Physiology and Pharmacology. I'm a physicist by training, and my expertise is in computational methods and risk assessment in toxicology.
Dr. Don Giovanni.
Hi, I'm John DiGiovanni. I'm also at the University of Texas in Austin. I'm a professor in the Division of Pharmacology and Toxicology in the College of Pharmacy. I direct the center on campus, Center for Molecular Carcinogenesis and Toxicology. My area of expertise is chemicals, chemical toxicology, chemical carcinogenesis, and some aspects of radiation toxicity.
Thank you. Dr. Ryan Emanuel. not present today. Mr. Earl Fordham.
Good morning, Earl Fordham here. How are you doing, Kimberly? Good to meet you. And I'm the Deputy Director at the Office of Radiation Protection at the Washington State Department of Health. I'm a certified health physicist, and my expertise is in the field of radiation protection and radiation safety. I'm also a professional engineer in the state of Washington.
Dr. Rebecca Fry.
Hi, everyone. I'm professor and chair in the Department of Environmental Sciences and Engineering at UNC Chapel Hill. I also run our Institute for Environmental Health Solutions and the Superfund Research Program. My expertise is in the area of epigenetics and toxicology.
Dr. John Guggenheimer.
Hi, I'm John Guggenheimer, Emeritus Professor of Mathematics, Cornell University. My expertise is in nonlinear dynamics.
Dr. Steve Hamburg.
Yeah, Stephen Hamburg, Chief Scientist, the Environmental Defense Fund. I'm a biogeochemist and ecosystem forest ecologist.
Dr. Celine Hernandez Ruiz. Dr. Alina Irwin.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Kimberly, for being our new chair. I'm Alina Irwin. I'm at Ohio State University. I'm an environmental economist. I also direct the Sustainability Institute at Ohio State. My area of expertise is in land use change, and impacts on water quality and other ecosystem services.
Dr. David Kaiser.
Hi, I'm Dave Kaiser. I'm also an environmental economist. I'm at UMass Amherst, in the Department of Resource Economics. And most of my work today has focused on the economics of water resources.
Dr. Marc Le Chevalier. I don't think he's here today. Dr. Angela Lund. Lisa Lonefight. Dr. Lala Ma.
Are you able to hear me?
Oh, yes. Yes, thank you.
Oh, sorry about that. Greetings to our new chair, Dr. Jones. My name is Lisa Lonefight. I'm from the MHA Nation. I'm the senior science advisor for our tribal council. Our tribes are the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara. We are situated in the political boundaries of North Dakota, and my formal education is in land resources and environmental sciences, and I'm specifically a remote sensing scientist. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Lala Ma. Dr. Enid Neptune. Dr. Sheila Olmstead.
No, I'm here. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
yes. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Enid Neptune. I'm at Johns Hopkins. I'm the director of pulmonary genetics, and I work on the mechanisms of genetic and environmental kind of causes of airspace disorders.
Thank you. Dr. Sheila Olmstead.
Hi, thanks so much for your leadership, Dr. Jones. I'm a professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, which is at the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm an environmental economist.
Dr. Austin Omer. Dr. Gloria Post.
Hi, I'm Gloria Post. I'm a research scientist in the Division of Science and Research at the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. I'm a toxicologist, and I work on human health effects and risk assessment of contaminants found in New Jersey's environment. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Amanda Rodewald.
Hi, welcome, Kimberly. So I'm the Garvin Professor and Senior Director of the Center for Avian Population Studies at Cornell University, so based at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and in the Department of Natural Resources and the Environment, and I'm an ecologist by training.
Thank you. Dr. Jonathan Samet.
Hi, John Samet at the Colorado School of Public Health with background in epidemiology and pulmonary medicine, and worked on a wide range of environmental issues.
Thank you. Dr. Leanne Shepard.
Hi, Kimberly. My name is Leanne Shepard, and I am at the University of Washington, and I'm also chair of the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee and I'm a biostatistician by training.
Thank you. Dr. Drew Schindel.
Hi, everybody, and welcome, Dr. Jones. I'm a professor at Duke in the School of the Environment, and my expertise is primarily in air pollution and climate change science.
Dr. Janae Smith. Dr. Daniel Stram.
Hi, I'm Daniel Stram, and I'm at the University of Southern California, where I'm a biostatistician, and I have primary interests or a lot of statistical interests in problems related to radiation epidemiology.
Dr. Peter Thorne. Dr. Godfrey Uzochekwu.
Yeah, good afternoon. Hello, Dr. Jones. Welcome on board. I'm at North Carolina A&T State University. My area is environmental processes and waste management.
Dr. Dominique van der Mensbroek.
Good afternoon, all. I'm professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Purdue University and director of the Center for Global Trade Analysis. My expertise is in the economics of climate change and integrated assessment methods.
Dr. Wei-Sung Wang.
Here, I'm a health physicist and a professor at the Center for Energy Studies at Louisiana State University. My expertise is in radiation protection and risk assessment.
Dr. June Weintraub.
Good morning. I'm Dr. June Weintraub. I'm an epidemiologist at the San Francisco Department of Health in the Environmental Health Branch, and I am a civil and environmental engineer by academic training. And I'm happy to be here and welcome Dr. Jones.
Dr. Jacoby Wilson.
Hey, Jacoby Wilson, professor with the Maryland Institute for Applied Environmental Health. I direct the EJ Lab and also the Center for Community Engagement and Environmental Justice and Health, SIEGE. And also I'm co-director of the Region 3, EPA Region 3 TIC-TAC, Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Center. And happy to see you, Dr. Jones. Welcome aboard. Go Howard.
Dr. Douglas Wolf.
Hello, I'm Doug Wolf. I'm currently a senior fellow with Syngenta Crop Protection in the U.S. I'm a veterinary pathologist by training with a background in toxicology pathology and molecular pathology and interest in carcinogenesis. I've been working on implementing new approach methodologies and chemical evaluation over the past several years. Nice to be here. Thanks.
Dr. Yuliang Zhu.
Good morning. I'm Yuliang Zhu, professor and chief in the Division of Epidemiology, Biostatistics, and Preventive Medicine at University of New Mexico School of Medicine. My training background is in computer science, stats, and risk assessment. In my current capacity, I tend to walk between many different fields as a collaborator and as an independent investigator. Glad to be here.
Thank you. And then we have the SAB liaisons. These are the chairs of other EPA scientific and technical advisory committees. So first is the EPA Board of Scientific Counselors, Dr. Paul Gilman.
Hi, until recently, Chief Sustainability Officer of a company called Covanta. Technical background is ecology and evolutionary biology. And Kimberly, thanks for agreeing to serve.
The FIFRA Scientific Advisory Panel Chair, Dr. Robert Chapin. The TSCA Science Advisory Committee on Chemicals, Dr. George Cobb.
Hi, I'm George Cobb. I'm the chair of environmental science at Baylor University. I'm an environmental chemist, primarily in the area of exposure assessment. It's a pleasure to be here. Just mostly listening in today to figure out how you folks do things. Thanks for inviting me.
And the Children's Health Protection Advisory Committee, and I believe from that committee today, Dr. Kay Yan is present.
Hi, yes, I'm Ki. I'm an associate professor from Medical College of Wisconsin. I'm also the director of the biostatistics core here at Children's Hospital of Wisconsin. And I'm here to represent the Children's Health Protection Advisory Committee today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all very much. With that, I'm now going to turn the meeting over to Tom Brennan, Director of the SAB Office, for introductory remarks.
Thank you, Tom, and welcome everyone, SAB members, board liaisons, my EPA colleagues that might be looking in, and members of the public. Welcome all to this SAB meeting. I'd like to thank the members for their public service, for taking time out of your professional careers and times out of your lives to provide this service for EPA. So thank you on behalf of EPA. We all really appreciate your efforts. I'd like to acknowledge my EPA colleagues who spent months and months and months, maybe years and years of work on the content that we'll be discussing today. So thank you to my EPA colleagues for all that hard work. And I'd also like to thank my teammates in the SAB staff office. They've done so much work helping with report writing and logistics and every which way following FACA requirements. And it takes a lot to make a meeting like this come together. So I'd like to thank my teammates for that. This is the first meeting of the SAB in our new fiscal year. And as Tom Armitage mentioned, that features some changes for us this year. And, you know, it's always hard when experienced SAB members either move on from the board or time out of their service. But it's also an exciting opportunity for new experts to bring new perspectives. And as we just saw during that go round, I mean, we have a very impressive group of individuals here, and I'm very much looking forward to working with this iteration of the board. And it is now my pleasure to, for the first time, introduce and turn over the meeting to our new chair, Dr. Kimberly Jones from Howard University. Kimberly, thank you so much for stepping into this leadership role. It means a lot to me personally and a lot to the agency, and I'm sure to your fellow board members. It's a big job, and we really, really appreciate you doing it, and we're thrilled to have you here. So Dr. Jones, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Tom, and thank you to everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. It's my honor to serve as the chair of the EPA Science Advisory Board. I first served on the SAB, I think beginning in 2011, where I also chaired the Drinking Water Committee for a few years. So it's just really nice to be back on the SAB, especially given some of the really impactful science that's been evaluated by the board at this time. So I just want to say I'm so happy to be here. I also want to welcome members of the Charter Science Advisory Board, SAB liaisons, staff, and others to this public meeting of the Science Advisory Board. So I want to begin by reviewing the purpose of the meeting and also the agenda. So we're meeting today to do three things. One, conduct a quality review of a draft SAB report titled Review of BINMAP and Benefits Methods. We're going to discuss a draft SAB report on a proposed rule titled Greenhouse Gas Reporting Rule, Revisions and Confidentiality Determinations for Petroleum and Natural Gas Systems. And then we'll discuss recommendations received from the SAB Work Group for review of science supporting EPA decisions concerning SAB review of EPA plant regulatory actions. I want to go over the agenda briefly. I know you received it via email, and it's also posted on the website, but I want to just go over just a summary of the whole meeting. The first item, as you know, is this is a public comment period. The Federal Advisory Committee Act, or FACA, requires that members of the public have an opportunity to provide comments at SAB meetings. To my knowledge, we have not received any requests from members of the public to provide oral comments at this meeting. So I would note that in addition to having the opportunity to provide oral comments, members of the public may submit written public comments. Any written public comments received are posted on the SAB meeting webpage and made available to SAB members. There's also an additional public comment on the agenda at the end of our deliberations today. So members of the public who wish to provide short, about 2 to 3 minute clarifying comments near the end of the meeting today should send an email to the DFO, Tom Armitage. His email address is on the SAB meeting website. So since we've not received comments or requests for oral comments after I finish, we'll move directly to the second agenda item, which is a quality review of the SAB draft report titled Review of BIM-MAP and Benefits Methods. This report was developed by an SAB panel chaired by Dr. Drew Schindel, who I see is here today. All reports prepared by SAB committees and panels must undergo quality review and be approved by the chartered SAB before being transmitted to the EPA administrator. So the third item for today is a discussion of a draft report developed by an SAB work group on the proposed EPA rule titled Greenhouse Gas Reporting Rule, Revisions and Confidentiality Determinations for Petroleum and Natural Gas Systems. So the SAB work group's draft report provides advice in response to questions focusing on some important issues regarding the proposed rule. These issues include responsiveness of the rule to requirements of the Inflation Reduction Act's Methane Emissions Reduction Program, the scientific and technical basis of a definition of a separate emission category of other large emission events, whether EPA's choices of emission thresholds are reasonable, challenges likely to arise in detection of emissions, and whether the EPA should consider increased reporting to provide data on non-methane emissions from sources reported through the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. So to begin discussion of the draft report, I'll first ask SAB members, Drs. David Allen and Stephen Hamburg, to provide a brief summary of the scope of the work group report and include the topics and the questions they addressed. I'd then like to discuss and reach agreement on the draft report. Then I'll ask for comments and any suggested revisions or additions from SAB members. In our discussions, I would like to reach agreement on any changes needed in the report, and we can discuss findings or recommendations beyond the scope of the charge questions also. We don't have to develop the revised report text at this meeting. So if we can agree on report changes, I'll then ask SAB members to send revised text to the DFOs who worked on the report, Tom Armitage and Brian Bloomer, after the meeting, or we can agree that I can work with the DFOs to incorporate changes after this meeting. After we discuss the greenhouse gas reporting rule, we'll discuss recommendations provided to the chartered SAB in a memorandum from the SAB work group for review of science supporting EPA decisions, or the SSD work group. The work group sent the chartered SAB recommendations concerning the review of the science supporting two planned EPA regulatory actions. So we'll decide whether we agree with the work group's recommendations and whether any follow-up activities are needed. The memo providing work group recommendations is posted in the materials for this meeting on a website and was also emailed to SAB board members. So before we begin, I would like to pause here and ask if any SAB members have any questions about any items on the agenda that I just summarized for you. You can if you raise your electronic hand, I think we'll see that and be able to address them, and I will do my best to monitor, and I'll ask Tom to help me out, but I don't see any hands right now. So as I mentioned, the next item is a public comment period. We have not received any requests, so we will move directly to the second agenda item. So I'd now like to begin a quality review of the SAB draft report titled Review of BIM-MAP and Benefits Methods. The quality review of SAB panel and committee reports is a key function of the chartered SAB. The board must make a determination about the quality of all draft reports developed by SAB panels. The chartered SAB decides whether SAB panel reports are ready for transmittal to the EPA. We have before us a panel report submitted for quality review. So we'll first hear a brief introduction from Dr. Drew Schindel, chair of the SAB BIM-MAP and Benefits Methods panel that conducted the review and developed the draft report. After he provides his summary, we'll hear comments from SAB members designated as lead reviewers. The lead reviewers for this report are Dr. Susan Annenberg, Lala Ma, Dominique Vander Mintzbrug, and Jonathan Samet. After hearing the lead reviewer's comments, I'll ask Dr. Schindel if he'd like to provide a brief response. Then I'll ask SAB members for any additional comments as part of the quality review discussion. So our discussion today will focus on 4 questions that are the responsibility of the chartered SAB. 1, whether the original charge questions to the SAB panel were adequately addressed. 2, whether there are any technical errors or omissions in the report or issues that are inadequately dealt with in the SAB panel's report. 3, whether the SAB panel's report is clear and logical, and finally, whether the conclusions drawn or recommendations provided are supported by the body of the SAB panel's report. I'll then entertain a motion about the disposition of the report. And hopefully we can agree on the disposition and move it forward. So now I would like to ask Dr. Schindel to first introduce himself again briefly and then follow with a summary of the report. Dr. Schindel.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Yeah, so again, I'm Drew Schindel. I'm a professor in the School of the Environment at Duke in North Carolina, and I have spent a lot of time working on climate change over the years, and now a lot of time also on the economic and health impacts of climate change. So we had a really terrific panel. I really want to start by thanking all of the members of the panel who really put in a lot of time and effort and did a great job. Most of them are not here, but thanks to Dr. Neptune, who was on this panel with me. And thank you to those who from the SAB who have sent comments. I read through at least what I got yesterday because I was teaching this morning. Let me try to give you a quick summary. And actually, before I summarize, let me just make one statement about the background of how this report came about. And the report in the review and charge description of the charge question describes how the panel covers two separate topics. And indeed, I think there was even talk of having two separate panels. So this panel is this review covers a particularly large set of material compared to other panels I've been on. I think charge question 4 has 10 subparts that alone make it longer than many charge questions I've been entrusted to deal with on different panels. So I apologize in that sense that it is a rather long review. The two separate topics, separate but related topics we were really asked to look into by the EPA were the approach to identifying and valuing endpoints that should be quantified and monetized in the general sense, and then specifically how those effects are explicitly quantified and valued using the BenMap tool that EPA staff has created for regulatory purposes. So if you've had a chance to look at our review, you'll see that there are the first 5 charge questions refer to that first general issue, and then the remainder refer to BenMap specifically. And so that's the same if you were to look, for example, at our recommendations. The first set refer to the general methodology of evaluating the benefits of air quality improvements associated with federal regulations. The second part referred to BenMap. And since much of what we suggest for BenMap comes from the response to how benefits should be evaluated, I'll kind of start there and spend a little more time there. What we looked at were the ways that the current evaluation of benefits was done. In general, we were very supportive of the way EPA has developed a strong and rigorous and generally well-documented process for deciding what should be included when evaluating public health benefits. There were a couple things that we have several comments relating to improvements that we think could be made in the way that the benefits are evaluated. And one issue in particular is that of uncertainties, where if you look at how the uncertainties are currently evaluated, is primarily that the calculations take into account the uncertainty in the beta function, really the slope of the exposure response function from epidemiological work, which is definitely an important factor in the uncertainties and should remain there. But there are uncertainties in other components as well. There are uncertainties in the exposure itself, and there are uncertainties in the population, both the numbers of people and their socio-demographic characteristics going forward in time. And so one of the overarching themes of several of our recommendations is that the EPA in general expand the treatment of uncertainties, in that we to try to account for uncertainties in exposure as well as exposure response functions and the population itself, and furthermore, uncertainties in how we monetize the value of the health outcomes, which again has not been historically included. So we recommend several ways to, for example, use projections of potential scenarios for demographic information in the future rather than a single deterministic projection, for including uncertainty in the value of a statistical life that's used for monetization, and in part as a way to improve the characterization of uncertainty in the exposure response function. We did recommend that two related things. We recommended that the EPA incorporate more studies that were not necessarily just restricted to the United States and Canada, and potentially incorporate more health outcomes, and not only those for which the integrated scientific assessment, the ISA process, had identified a causal or likely causal outcome. And those would, of course, then have a different probability distribution for occurring, and therefore a different risk, and therefore a different weighting of the economic valuation down the line. But those were several of the main recommendations related to the first part, to the general benefits methodology. The last point I guess I should make is that one of the other recommendations that you'll see in the tier 1 list is that the EPA, instead of presenting several individual potential health outcomes based on single epidemiological studies, that they present a single pooled estimate. Primarily, the panel felt that the results from individual studies were useful for the scientific community, but were not generally as useful for policymakers, and that pooling the results in such a way as to incorporate the uncertainty across different epidemiological studies would be an improvement. That underlines also one of the reasons why incorporation of studies that are not restricted to the US and Canada would allow more studies to go into that meta-analysis. An example are studies that are international. So they include the US and Canada, but they also include other parts of the world. Those are currently omitted, and therefore it becomes harder to do a meta-analysis because the remaining body of literature is much smaller. Regarding the VSL itself and the income elasticity, there were, as I mentioned, the questions about those had many, many subparts, so it might look like there was not as many questions about that, but there were in fact a lot of material going in there, and we had a couple major recommendations. One is to improve the estimates associated with particularly various morbidity outcomes, which in many cases are based on cost of illness approaches, which the panel felt were inadequate in many cases to really capture the full range of monetized values. And so we recommended that the EPA undertake a review using benefits transfer to turn those into willingness to pay approaches and try to incorporate quality of life to get better, more comprehensive estimates for many of the morbidity outcomes. The other thing we recommended regarding VSL and specifically the question addressed to us on income elasticity was that there was a fundamental inconsistency in the way that EPA has been applying estimates of VSL as a function of time. And so typically that the VSL is set at the start of the period that's analyzed, and then it is increased with time as the regulation is presumed to take effect in the modeling. But if a regulation goes into effect, and we have some examples on this in 1990, then the VSL is adjusted for income increases in future years. But if a regulation goes into effect in 2020, then you would start with the same VSL in this method. And therefore, when you get to, say, the present, 2023, you would have different VSLs depending on the regulation that's being analyzed because they start at different points. And so we recommend that a more consistent approach be developed where the VSL is not tied to the start of the regulation, but is adjusted relative to the date at which the study the data set from which the study's results were taken from the data of that data itself, which turns out to be on average in the studies that the EPA currently uses all the way back into the 1970s. So this potentially has a large impact on the results, and we therefore recommend that at the same time that this method of consistently treating income adjustments over time is adopted, that the VSL itself be updated to avoid getting strange results. To shift in, and I'll try to be brief here, this will be a little shorter than the first one. The second part is the recommendations for BENMAP, and essentially many of those are to incorporate the recommendations from the more general evaluation of how benefits are calculated. So for example, BENMAP should also represent the results from the pooled estimates with the associated uncertainties from the first part of our review. But in more specific BENMAP things were largely about improving the user experience so that it was easier in particular for the users to access many of the underlying data sets, which in some cases we felt were not very transparent to follow. There were some kind of more computer science related recommendations, such as developing discrete benchmarks to allow analysis of individual components, which would make it easy for users to check their behavior and that they hadn't been, say, inadvertently affected when modifications were made. A little bit larger effort, but also useful, would be if the EPA were able to adopt more of the community-based approach, such as has been used with the CMAC, the Community Multiscale Air Quality Modeling System, or WRF, the Weather Research and Forecasting System, where many users around the world are able to contribute, and that would reduce the burden on EPA to, in part, to keep up with the science, but also to respond to our long list of recommendations because they could benefit from the wider user community's input. At the same time, many on the panel were not from government, but from academia, like many of us here on the SAB, and strongly encouraged the EPA to maintain BENMAP's utility to the research community, which means allowing things like users to potentially input their own data surfaces, their own exposure response functions, their own, et cetera, et cetera. I think those were the main. Yes, I think, and so in light of that, just the last point is then to make it easier to, say, prepare air quality surfaces, we recommend that they improve the guidance on that and improve the flexibility of the input surfaces so that they are not, for example, tied to the formation of a single model like CMAC, but can take generic, widely used data set formats such as NetCDF, for example. So I think those are that's my attempt to summarize, what is it, an roughly 80-page result, review rather, in a few minutes, but I am happy to engage in a discussion about anything that the SAB members found interesting in there. So I will turn it back over to Dr. Jones, I believe.
Yes, thank you so much for that very, very nice review, Dr. Schindel. I now like to ask the lead reviewers for their comments in response to the quality review questions. I'd like to start with Dr. Annenberg.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Jones and Dr. Schindel, for that very thorough summary of the report. It was a very nice report. Really enjoyed reading it. I thought it was very responsive to the charge questions and really thoughtful and contained a lot of thoughtful analysis. So I thought it was the charge questions to the panel were thoroughly addressed. let me just stop for a second and just say for full disclosure, I used to work in the group at EPA that develops the BEDMAP model at the Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards. It's been almost 10 years, but I just wanted to make that clear. So I thought the whole report was very high quality. It carefully addressed the technical questions, made thoughtful and well justified and very clear recommendations. I only had a few places where I thought improvements can be made. I have to make an adjustment to one of the items in my written comments and then add another one as well. So my first comment is an overarching one, which is, of course, no fault of the review committee whatsoever, but there was a new update to the Office of Management and Budget Circular A4, which was released on November 9th of 2023. And that's the guidance document for the government to conduct benefit cost assessments. It goes into effect March 1st, 2024. And it could impact EPA's benefit assessment methods, likely will. I haven't had a chance myself to do an analysis of the changes in Circular A4. Since the update to the circular was published after the review committee's draft report, it seems like it would slow down the process too much to ask the committee to try to consider how the changes to Circular A4 would affect the report. And therefore, my suggestion would be to recommend in the report that EPA consider how the changes to Circular A4 affects the benefits methods and evaluate their response to the SAB's recommendations in light of those changes to Circular A4. So that's just to keep the process moving and not to overburden the review committee for this BEDMAP software. More specifically on some of the items in the report, just a few things. One is about the baseline rates of death and disease. And this is question 2.2.b. The question is whether those baseline rates of death and disease are resolved to the appropriate spatial and temporal scale for performing benefits analyses. And the report recommends that all baseline rates of death and disease be resolved at the county level. EPA has taken steps to develop census tract level all-cause mortality rates. I thought those were already included in the default BEDMAP download, but I checked that after my written comments, and I don't think they are yet, but they can be. So these have now been published in a report that was done by Environmental Defense Fund and Industrial Economics, which I've linked in my written comments. So those can be incorporated into the default BEDMAP download, and I think tract level disease rates would improve the agency's capabilities in terms of doing distributional assessments of benefits in their regulations. Question 2.2.d, are the assumptions EPA is making and projecting death rates reasonable? I agree with the committee to use a scenario analysis approach as opposed to a deterministic approach. I just thought that we should consider here that the EPA is also taking a scenario analysis approach in other aspects. For example, the social cost of greenhouse gas updates that were developed as part of the November 2022 supplemental proposal for oil and gas emission standards, and wondered whether there could be consistencies between those scenario analysis approaches. So just something to potentially point out in the report. There was only one area that I thought the report left a little to be desired in terms of responding fully to the question, and that's question 2.5.d, whether and how EPA could account for uncertainties associated with the shape of the concentration response function, particularly at low concentrations. There was some good discussion about low concentrations, but I thought the rationale was unclear. And I had some suggestions here for how it could be clearer, and also no suggestion was given for the upper bound that I could see in the response, the upper bound to the uncertainty bound here. So that's just one thing to potentially improve. And then there's only one other somewhat minor area that I took a bit of issue with, which is the suggestion in the report in question 2.6.d that the EPA could provide users with a kind of ranking of quality for particular concentration response functions. I personally don't think that's really possible to do because the choice of the concentration response functions depends so heavily on the context of the analysis. And I just thought that was not going to be a possible recommendation to implement. But despite those areas, as Dr. Schindel mentioned, it's quite a long and thorough report. So these few areas are a minor portion of that. And the draft report is very clear and logical, and the conclusions and recommendations are supported by the body of the report. I just had one other change to add to my written comments that just kind of came to light as Dr. Schindel was explaining the report, which is to make clear that there is the downloadable software version of BenMap and the online version of BenMap, and which recommendations apply to which of those two, because I think they have different capabilities. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Annenberg. Great comments. I don't think Dr. Ma is here, but my understanding is she plans to submit written comments that we will have to review. So I would like to go to Dr. Dominique van der Minsbro for comments if.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Sure. So I will focus most of my comments on the use of alternative scenarios, but I would like to start to say that the charge questions I thought were well addressed. The report is largely clear and logical, and the conclusions, recommendations are supported by the body of the draft. So getting to the three of the questions we were asked to answer. I do believe that it would be very useful to have a range of potential outcomes. I was a little bit surprised to see that they would be driven by the SSPs. SSPs, for those of you who aren't familiar with them, these are the so-called shared socioeconomic pathways that are being used by the international climate change community to look at various different scenarios for population and GDP at a country level. So they're pretty blunt with respect to what is necessary for BenMap. I understand that there are downscale projections that are available at the county level, I think, but there's a lot of other information in the SSPs that could potentially influence the downscaling as well. So one comment, first of all, we need to be clear what the end year projections are, because that was not clear in the current document. So if the end year projection is 2030, the scenario analysis isn't going to be all that helpful for looking ahead 7 years. If you go out to 2050 or 2100, there the projections, of course, could make a very large difference. On the underlying storylines of the SSPs, there's a lot of kind of qualification of these storylines. So SSP1 is the so-called green scenario, so kind of a green-based development, whereas SSP5 is a fossil fuel-driven development, and presumably those would have very different impacts on kind of the projections from using BenMap as the underlying kind of use of energy is very, very different. There are also storylines related to the underlying population dynamics. So even though SSP5, for example, is a low population growth scenario at the global level, for the US, actually, it's pretty high growth. And I suspect a lot of that's coming from immigration rather than high fertility rates. So again, I would think that that would affect the socio-demographic characteristics that one would want to project when using BenMap. So in summary, I think it would be useful to develop BenMap specific storylines, which could run off of the SSP storylines, but then focus more on what would be of major interest when you're looking at BenMap projections. So obviously contrasting different growth patterns for vulnerable populations, migrants and minority populations, and contrasting different growths in kind of the production and consumption technologies. So, we could imagine one growth scenario where it's almost all renewable electricity and electrification by and large throughout the economy, which would be very different than from production technologies that rely on conventional fossil fuels. As well, in line with the previous reviewer, I think it would be possible to coordinate some of these scenarios with other parts of the EPA, and I had there in mind specifically the SAGE team, which is looking at state level projections and the economics of climate change. I only have I had other comments in my written statement, but I'll just limit myself right now. I think on uncertainty, I agree with the report. I think it would be important as well to identify the possible covariance across the uncertain parameters and variables. And if you're doing Monte Carlo simulation, it seems to me you're going to want to sample not purely randomly, but also imposing a specific correlation matrix to the extent that can be identified. And then on the modeling framework, as was mentioned earlier as well, I think it's important here to make sure that, so I think it's great for the web-based interface. It will be helpful for many users, but I think it'd be really important to make sure that the model is fully modularized, so input and output would be geared towards specific user communities, but you'd want the core model to be consistent across all of these, and you'd want the core model available to be used in more complex workflows, especially for those of us who would think about doing Monte Carlo simulations or multiple simulation runs. So I'll limit myself to that right now.
Thank you so much. We'll now ask Dr. Jonathan Samet to provide his comments.
Sure. So, Joe, congratulations to your panel. This is a lot of work. So I have several comments, and one in terms of the charge questions being adequately addressed. They certainly were, and by my count, there's 27 Tier 1 recommendations, and there were 17 included in the letter to the administrator. They're of different sorts in terms of both procedural issues, data gaps that need to be filled. There's really a long-term research agenda here, and to the extent that you could put a little structure around those, perhaps particularly in the letter to the administrator, I think it would be useful. The charge questions about errors and omissions and the clear and logical, I think the report is right on target. I had three comments where I think further justification might be needed. So the first, in part, and Susan touched a little bit on this, is whether estimates from studies outside of the United States and Canada should be sought. And I think the question there would be, when should they be, or why should they be? I mean, for example, for major mortality outcomes, we have now estimates from major national cohorts, including Medicare and the National Health, the NHIS, the National Health Surveys. So we have national level data for some outcomes, which would seem to me to be preferred. So I think if the panel is to make that recommendation, it needs some greater specificity as to when a search for such studies should be undertaken. Part of the problem is that there are literally thousands of epidemiological studies being reported annually at this point, with a great expansion of international work. And if the panel wants to send the EPA down the path of doing systematic reviews and meta-analysis, it is a substantial commitment and effort. So, perhaps to encourage EPA to think about when they should look at external estimates would be useful, but inevitably, I think it's as obvious, there'll be challenges of heterogeneity of estimates when a large body, potentially a large body, is looked at. I also question the inclusion of those health outcomes from the ISAs for which the level of certainty is at the suggestive level. I was chair of CASAC when the 5-level classification was introduced, and we had substantial discussion on this issue. And in part, it relates, as Drew said, to the level of certainty around the causal relationship, and those for which the evidence is suggestive, of course, are less certain. There was agreement that those outcomes for which the evidence was causal or likely to be a causal would be moved into the regulatory impact analysis if these additional outcomes were considered. Suggestive BENMAP would not, in fact, be parallel with what is done in the regulatory impact analyses, and there would be a substantial expansion of the scope of work to develop the concentration response functions for less certain outcomes. So I was concerned there both about the additional effort and then the misalignment with what was being done for the criteria of pollutants. And then last, I had a comment about considering the earlier studies that used total suspended particulate matter, which was the original index for PM when the Clean Air Act was implemented. I looked at these earlier studies and just have concerns about whether you can really extrapolate from the TSP of the 1970s to PM 2.5 of the 21st century and make some comments there. So I would just suggest that that recommendation be reconsidered. So those are my comments.
Thank you, Dr. Samet. Now, I'd like to ask Dr. Schindel if he has any comments in response to the lead reviewers. You'd like to respond to any of those? I know there was a...
Sure. So, yeah, and thanks to all four. I have, and these were sent in several days ago, so I even had a chance to review or to think about them in advance. Well, I'll try see if I can do this briefly. I have notes, and I agree for Dr. Annenberg. Thanks so much for your feedback. I think all the comments are very well taken. The A4 update, you're right. I mean, it came out at a difficult time, but I completely agree that it would be good to suggest EPA, be mindful that now that this regulation exists, that they do their best to align with it going forward and see. I mean, it will clearly apply to things like social costs even more strongly, but they do recommend, from a quick read, things like more emphasis on distributional impacts, which I think actually align with what we're saying. So my initial inclination is that it's not going to require enormous changes other than discount rate when they do valuation, but mostly it looks good. For the census level data, again, I think we completely agree. We should recommend that be included, and between the time of having the review panel meetings and or sometime after that, I also encountered another EPA project, Nexus data output that they've done, which also includes census level data. So clearly it's out there in a couple different EPA projects, and I think it makes sense to suggest that EPA include that in BENMAP as well. I guess in some of the cases there's data for all-cause mortality, but not necessarily every individual endpoint they're going to look at, but definitely moving in that direction. Great suggestion to align the demographics with what's being done with the social cost for greenhouse gases. That makes perfect sense to me too. I think at the low exposure level, you have made me aware when I saw your comment that we didn't explain what we were thinking as clearly as it should have been, and that was one of the reasons for trying to bring in additional studies for some of the exposure response functions that were based on very limited data analysis, it was really hard to characterize the uncertainty if you only have, say, one or two studies. And so that was something where the rationale was to rely on a larger data set and hopefully be able to characterize that better. But I also saw when I reread it after seeing your comment that it was not so clearly explained. I think your comment about ranking the quality of CRFs being impossible is actually pretty spot on. So thank you for putting that out there. I think we might maybe it's worth some thought of whether we want to simply delete that recommendation or suggest that maybe the EPA could consider adding some information about in which contexts particular CRFs might be most useful if they are providing multiple. Finally, it was our understanding from the EPA group that they are no longer going to have a desktop version, that they are migrating fully to the web-based. So we can confirm that with them. But then there would no longer be two versions, and so everything would eventually be in the online version. For Lala Ma's comments, she's not here, but she sent an email saying, she had a tenure review and couldn't make it, but she did send written comments, and mainly she talked about the issue of data imputation and how that there were, while she generally agreed with the idea that we should use imputation when data was unavailable, pointed out that there were, with several references, that there were limitations to that, and there were cases where imputation would not necessarily always work, and so that we should add a little more description of that, which again I think we agree with. I've such a hard time with the name. Dominique's anyway. I won't dare the last.
It's fine.
Okay, for your comments, thank you as well. I think that there is not a single fixed end year that BENMAP can be used for, or that different regulations, as regulations are put in place over time, I think that they can be examined out to various points in time. So I agree with your points about the SSPs. They don't really matter very much in the short run, but when you get to the long run, as you pointed out, then they can matter. I think one of the things that I took from what you were just saying was that it would be useful to perhaps try to point out clearly to users that if they are, say, running a chemistry transport model to create an air quality surface, like that the emissions that they put into that model would be different if they're using a different SSP, because one might have a lot more people in the United States than another, for example. So, there's a possibility for an uninformed user who doesn't know what the SSPs are to come up with mismatches, and where the air quality surfaces don't really match the demographics. And so it would be important for them to be aware of that. It's my recollection, and I'll have to look back, was that when we talk about developing the overall uncertainty, that we talked about looking at all these different components, like I mentioned in the introduction, including the VSL, the exposure response function, the population, et cetera. But I don't think we really talked very much about the covariance. So I appreciate that comment. And I think we should add in and make some work, and might be a challenge for the EPA team to figure out what the covariance terms are. But I think it's something worth considering. And I think for having the core model available, well, your suggestion, if I understood it correctly, I think aligns very much with our panel conclusion that the EPA would benefit from things like having a community of users who all had access to this core model and could contribute their own code, which the same way the CMAC and WRF work, or users could simply use the core model for their own purposes. So I think we are very much aligned on that one. I guess my last set of comments then for Jonathan Samet. the idea for incorporating studies outside the US and Canada in part was to allow the EPA to use things like systematic reviews and meta-analysis that other groups had done. So I think your point is very well taken. We don't simply want to send them out to do huge amounts of work. That would be impractical. And it is not necessary for those endpoints where we have a lot of very high quality studies in the US, but there are some where there's not much data. And in some of those cases, there have been systematic reviews done by the community already, but since those reviews incorporate foreign or non-North American data, they don't currently fit under the EPA's system. So this would open the door to incorporating those when that was useful. But I think it's worth looking at the language again to make sure that, yeah, we don't just ask them to do a lot of additional work. For the inclusion of suggested impacts, I mean, that came out in part from the economists on our team who are very used to putting valuations on outcomes that are a function not only of how much people are willing to pay for avoided risk, but in some cases having very large uncertainties associated with the actual amount of avoided risk. So in their arguments, having a cause, for example, say ozone effects on cardiovascular mortality rather than respiratory, right, is not causal within the ISA, but there is a fair bit of suggestive evidence that could be, we know what people are willing to pay for reduced risk of death. The risk of death then would be associated with the epidemiological study with additional risk associated with the fact that we're not so convinced that it's causal as, say, respiratory. So they thought that we could include that, and by including those endpoints, we would have a better estimate than, we'd have an estimate with a large uncertainty for their valuation, but it would no longer encompass zero, which is the value we get when we leave them out entirely. And unlike, say, the uncertainties, which is pooling all the results, the endpoints for a given health outcome would all be reported individually. And so I don't think that there is a mismatch then with the regulatory impact analysis, because you could simply just take the list of those that were causal or likely causal and omit the rest, but they'd be there if you wanted. So we considered that a useful supplement. I'm certainly open to, making sure, I don't remember what tier it was, but that is a suggestion for EPA to explore doing that and not necessarily a requirement. And lastly, your comment about TSP and PM10, I think that's actually a very spot on comment, right? I mean, there are some papers that use a single factor for those, but you're right, it's going to vary spatially, it's going to vary in time as the source changes, and I think that one was overstated. So I appreciate you pointing that out. I think that's all I have to respond at the moment. Thanks, Dr. Jones.
Thank you, Dr. Shindell. That was really a very comprehensive report, comprehensive comments, and your reply and your response was really helpful. I'd now like to open the discussion to the entire board to see if any member of the SAB has additional comments. Please raise your electronic hand so we can call on you. All right, I see some hands, starting with Dr. Samet.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment back. Joe, I think if you commented that reliance on existing meta-analyses, for example, for other health outcomes that incorporate non-US studies, I think that would be just sort of a really helpful addition to the language that's there, making clear that you're not, hopefully mostly not setting EPA off on doing what would be rather probably complex and lengthy exercises that we're all still trying to figure out how to do to do these sorts of systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So,
thank you.
Great.
Dr. Su?
Thank you. I have a general comment. Then I have some sort of editorial comment I can put in writing later. Overall, I think the report is well balanced, very comprehensive. There might be concern that, when I look at the just number one, tier one recommendations, there's a long list. I echo Dr. Sammit's comment, there's a lot. So I wonder that if EPA is going to just incorporate all the tier one recommendations, what type of a burden that could be, and whether EPA has the technical capability or capacity to address them in a reasonable turnaround period. If we just focus on all the recommendations, tier one recommendation surrounding this uncertainty thing, and I agree with John that for one thing, if we want to systematically look into uncertainty, that will require a lot of researchers down the road. I don't know if EPA is ready to handle that. If you think about uncertainty, that comes from the data input, the exposure part, and the covariates, whatever they mean, and then the projection using SSP, and then uncertainty about valuations of benefits, and then of course there's uncertainty about the concentration response curves, so on and so forth. So on the last front, I would echo Dr. Enberg's comment that it's going to be really very subjective, if it's possible, to rank all these CR curves. But having a number of CR curves in the toolbox is a great opportunity to support uncertainty analysis and through sensitivity analysis. So we don't have to rank them, but we can look at the uncertainty due to variations in these CR curves. And then the key is really that uncertainty really involves propagation from upstream, downstream, then aggregation at the very end, downstream from the upstream sources. And this is going to be very complex. So that's my concern. So when we are making all these tier one recommendations, I wonder if we have taken into consideration whether EPA is in a position to respond and to incorporate, in a reasonable turnaround period. So that's my overall comment, and I'll think about it more, and I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Zhu. Dr. Guckenheimer?
So I'd like to really applaud the EPA on what they're doing with regard to BenMap compared to other numerical tools that we've evaluated. I think that the way in which they have organized this effort is much better. And I would really like to see the SAB encourage them. I mean, it's clear that this is an ongoing effort. It's not something that is finished. It's never going to be finished. And the idea of encouraging the EPA to stimulate a user community to coalesce around the online version of BenMap, to test it extensively, to make suggestions for improvements based upon expertise in different areas, to approach different agencies to get finer resolution data, for example, from the Census Bureau. All of those things are things that I hope will progress in the future. And in looking at, I think that the review committee did and wrote an excellent report. I would like to see a bit more emphasis upon the structure of the software and its organization in order to provide that encouragement of the EPA to invest resources in order to keep this going and to really see it evolve in a very sustainable and productive way.
Thank you. Are there any other comments? Yes, Dr. Shepherd.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple comments. As chair of the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, I thought the first two of Dr. Samet's comments resonated quite strongly. However, I also thought that Dr. Schindel provided some really useful clarifications in his follow-up, and I would just ask that those be clearly documented in the report so that for instance, using systematic reviews that have estimates outside the U.S. that makes sense because they're already available, and similarly that the input and role of economic analyses may be very different, and so just making that clear. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Dr. Su, do you have an additional comment, or is okay?
Yeah, I have a follow-up comment, technical on recommendations for uncertainty analysis. I wonder if the committee or the panel could make a recommendation more specific. For example, if you just ask the EPA to do a better uncertainty analysis, I don't really know if EPA know how to do it. If you feel like a holistic analysis or provide a range, provide a range of value based upon the data you have, or do a micro simulation, at least that EPA might be able to think more specifically how to address that.
Thank you. Dr. Uzochukwu?
Yes, I go by Uzo usually. That makes it easier. I just have a question on the letter, the administrator number 4. It says that the SAB recommends that EPA continue to use 20-year segmented lag to characterize the profile of health benefits from air pollution reductions over time, rather than moving to 5-year lag. So I want a little clarity on that. It's going from 20 years down to going back to 20 years instead of using 5.
Dr. Schindel, did you want to respond quickly to that?
Yeah, thank you. It's a question really that in response to a very specific question from the agency who has long used 20 about switching and instead using 5. And the panel felt that there was not a good justification to abandon the way of using 20. And in particular, 20 incorporates the first 5 and then adds in 15 more. So you don't lose anything. And there is evidence for some longer term impacts. So we felt that there was no compelling reason to change something that was actually working well.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Kaiser?
Thank you. This was a really comprehensive review, and I think that was really fantastic. I was curious to hear from Dr. Schindel about the value of the statistical life. To me, that's just such an important number and statistic. And I was curious whether or not the work group considered like raising or elevating that as the recommendation. I mean, to me, it's down a little bit lower as you're reading through the report. So wait a minute, they're really recommending that we revise this or update this, and I didn't know whether or not you felt like the language should be stronger, or if there had been any discussion about that. So I noticed that in some of these, it's like if whether or not EPA decides to update the BSL, we still recommend them to do this, or like it's a little bit lower down, like I think of recommendation number 6, but to me, like BSLs plays such an important role, and I didn't know whether or not that should be elevated on the list. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Stallworth?
Oh, hi, I'm Holly Stallworth. I worked with Drew Schindel on this report. And I just wanted to say we have on the line, on the Zoom link, we have Pete Maniloff in the Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards. So he was our client for this review, and he could speak to this issue of how EPA might deal with the 17 recommendations. I've heard several members of the SAB talk about that. I don't know if you want to hear from him for a minute or two, but he's on the line.
We do have some time, so yes.
Okay.
Willing
Pete.
to.
Sure. Hi. So the short answer is, 17 tier 1 recommendations and many more lower tier recommendations, right? And we asked a lot of questions, so that's fair. Yeah, we face resource constraints, and so we will have to prioritize in light of both our staffing constraints and the other constraints that we face, such as guidance from the new A4, right? We have the A4, we have EPA's guidelines for benefit cost analyses, right? Our work is bound by a number of protocols. And so we're going to prioritize in light of those and our staffing and financial resources.
Thank you.
I guess these are also on different timelines, right? And so we recognize that some of these are quite short-term and some of these are long-term research efforts.
Thank you for that response. It is helpful. Are there any other, sorry, that was mine. Are there any other comments from anyone? Or questions, comments, suggestions? All right. Dr. Stallworth, I see your hand. Is that left over? Or did you want to respond again? This is, okay.
Okay.
Thank you. All right, Dr. Shindell?
Yeah, I just thought maybe useful to respond to a couple things. In particular, Dr. Kaiser's comment, the EPA charge questions specifically did not ask us to comment on the VSL itself. So I totally agree with you. It's a super important number, but it is something that is used, agency-wide, not just within the air quality planning and standards. And so we were told that that was not in our purview, and that's the reason for the slightly awkward language. What we found was, as I mentioned in the introduction, right, if you're going to adjust incomes consistently from the date at which the data was taken for the original studies, then you come up with unreasonably large values of the VSL, which are not consistent with current literature because these studies are from the 70s and the new literature has moved on, and it's not consistent with what other agencies are using. So this was our kind of way to try to say, you wanted to know about income elasticity, you didn't want to know about VSL, but we're telling you that, by the way, when you do make the income elasticity work in a logical, sensible manner, you better change the VSL at the same time and revisit that issue, because otherwise you'll mess it up. So that's the short reason there. I guess the only other thing, while I have the floor briefly, is that in response to John Guggenheimer's comments and also to some of Yang Chu's, the idea of having the EPA support this being a community effort, I think is really appealing. I'm glad you supported that, John, but it also helps with some of the issues of how to do some of these uncertainties, right? So on the panel, we had a bunch of people that use BenMap routinely, and they work at state agencies, they work at universities, and they have students and postdocs and people who have already done several of the things that we're talking about. So when we look at BenMap, it has uncertainty only due to exposure response functions, but other researchers have put in evaluations of what's the uncertainty due to, say, the VSL, and some of the economics people who are using BenMap. Other peoples have already put in different SSPs, and therefore you can start to characterize uncertainty based on population and baseline mortality and all of these things. So you're right, getting every step of the way in the whole thing is a big process, but especially if EPA turns to this more community-supported model, I think that different research teams can help put in some of those different uncertainty components and make that a pretty tractable thing, although as Pete Maniloff just told us, right, and is correct, it will take time and there'll be a need to prioritize. But we really did think that the research community, including many of the panelists, have a lot to contribute that can make getting through this long list of recommendations much more tractable for the agency. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shindell. Dr. Weintraub?
Thank you. So thank you, everyone, for this is a lot of work and an interesting discussion. And at the risk of over restating what's already been stated, I mean, I do appreciate the EPA, clarification that, of course, they'll address all of our, of our tier 1 must do recommendations. But I do think it's to the extent that we are able to split some out into should or could, I think that is our responsibility to do that, and they are relying on us to help them prioritize, rather than putting all the tier 1s into like a single bucket. And so I would definitely, I'm not sure exactly where we're landing here, but I would just like to put my vote in, if you will, for trying to move a few of the tier 1s into tier 2s or below.
Thank you. Are there any other comments or questions from our board members? All right. I do not see any hands, and I do not see anything in the chat. So I think this was a really nice discussion. It seems that there are potentially some things that the panel could do to clarify some of the questions that we heard, but it is now time for us to decide what we want to do with the report. So I would now ask for a motion for an SAB decision on the draft report and ask that it be seconded. So we have 4 categories typically. 1, approval of the report either as is or subject to editorial changes and review by only the chair, myself. The second option is approval of the report subject to re-review by designated board members, and those could be lead reviewers. And if we decided to do this, I would ask for any other volunteers who wanted to take a look at it. The third is return of the draft report to the authoring panel for further work so that a revised report can be brought before the board for a second quality review. And the last option is that we can recommend that the SAB staff office constitute an entirely new committee or panel to complete the advisory activity. So I would like to now call for a motion for the disposition of this report.
I can make a motion to approve the report subject to review by the chair of the committee.
Second.
Okay, so I just wanted to be clear. So you're going with option 1, which is approval of the report, either as is or subject to editorial changes and review by only the SAB chair. Or are you saying, you said committee chair, so do you mean to send it back to the panel?
For the panel to make any changes in response to the discussion here today, and Dr. Jones to be the ultimate reviewer.
Okay.
Correct.
That was seconded. Thank you. I'd like to call the question by voice vote. Maybe we'll see how that goes. So all those in favor of the motion, which was to approve the report with editorial changes with review by myself. All those in favor?
Yes.
Aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Any abstentions?
Yes, Doug Wolf, I'm abstaining.
Thank you. So the motion passed. Thank you, everyone. That was a fantastic review. It was I have to admit, it was a very comprehensive charge that we had. And I think the committee, I want to commend the committee, particularly Dr. Shindell for this excellent summary and for responding to all the many comments. I want to thank the lead reviewers and other board members for all the hard work on this. So I will depend on Holly Stallworth to work with me to get this report finalized. So we'll be in touch to do that. So we are a little bit ahead of time. We had until 3:50. So I would like to just still give us a bit of a break. So if everyone is okay with a 10-minute break, I will ask that you please come back at 3:20 p.m. Eastern time. So that's about 10 minutes. If you could come back at 3:20 p.m. Eastern, and we will continue with our agenda. Thank you. All right, it is 3:20 and I'd like to welcome everyone back. Give everyone a few more seconds to just make it back here. So the next item on our agenda is a discussion of an SAB draft report on the EPA rule titled Greenhouse Gas Reporting Rule, Revisions and Confidentiality Determinations for Petroleum and Natural Gas Systems. So the proposed rule was published in the Federal Register on August 1st, 2023. So we're reviewing the science supporting this rule as part of our statutory duties. The SAB is required by law to receive information from EPA about the science supporting plan, regulatory actions when they're provided to any other federal agency for formal review and comment. So the board may then decide to review the adequacy of the scientific and technical basis of the planned actions. At the SAB meeting held on June 23rd, 2023, the board discussed the proposed greenhouse gas reporting rule and decided that the SAB should review the science supporting rule. After the board meeting on June 23rd, the SAB staff office formed a work group chaired by Dr. David Allen to review the proposed rule, and the work group developed a draft report on the rule. The SAB work group considered the proposed rule and developed a draft report that's been posted on the SAB website. A link to the proposed rule reviewed by the work group is provided in a footnote in the draft report. So now I'd like to discuss the draft report and reach agreement on any changes or additions needed before it's transmitted to the EPA as a final SAB report. So to begin the discussion, I'll ask Drs. Allen and Hamburg to provide a brief summary of the work group report. I'll then ask for comments and discussion from all SAB members. So in our discussion, I'd like to reach agreement on any changes needed to the report. And if we agree upon a report change, I'll then ask members to send a revised text to the DFOs, Tom Armitage and Brian Bloomer, after this meeting, or we could agree that I'll work with Drs. Allen, Hamburg, and the DFOs to incorporate the change after the meeting. So now I'd like to ask Drs. Allen and Hamburg to provide brief introductions of themselves, followed by a summary of the draft report. Drs. Allen and Hamburg, if you are back.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Jones. And what I would propose to do is I'll begin by introducing myself. I'm Dave Allen from the University of Texas at Austin. And then I would propose to do two things and then turn it over to Dr. Hamburg for his additional comments and then any comments from the remainder of the work group. The two things I'd like to do is just remind the board of the reasons why in our June meeting we decided to have the work group review this rule. Then I would like to step through the three major items that are covered in this report to the SAB, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Hamburg and other members of the work group. Before I do that, though, let me just thank all the members of the work group that participated in this, because it was a very expedited review. As Dr. Jones noted, this proposal appeared in the Federal Register in early August. And so we were responding to the proposal from the EPA very quickly, but it is on a very rapid time track. So I'd like to thank all the panel members for their expeditious work on this report. The second thing I want to do, just for the spirit of transparency, is to note that in the public docket on this proposal, I, as an individual, submitted comments. They're of a very detailed technical nature, as opposed to the high-level recommendations in this report. That was disclosed to the SAB staff, and they determined there was no conflict of interest associated with that. So with that, let me go ahead and begin. Just remind the board and introduce to the new members who weren't here at the June meeting why the board decided that the work group should look at this. Now, this is a reporting rule, so greenhouse gas reporting, particularly for oil and gas, but it has important intersections with other both legislative actions and also regulations from the EPA, which the board has previously reviewed. The intersection with law is the Inflation Reduction Act, which establishes a methane fee beginning in 2024. And that methane fee is based on the reporting that is done under the greenhouse gas reporting program. So fees on methane emissions will be based on this reporting. The second thing that this intersects with is a methane rule on which the board commented in its proposal stage. We're still anticipating the final rule. And that was the methane emissions rule for oil and gas facilities that included, among other things, a new super emitter program that allows for the identification of large emission events based on snapshot measurements, instantaneous measurements of high emission rate events. And so those were among the reasons why the board initiated this review. And so with that, let me proceed to the comments that we made. We had 3 questions and then responses. The first was on the accuracy of the reporting that would occur under the proposal. The second is the definitions of large emission events. And then the third is additional data that are required. And so let me step through each of those 3, beginning with this requirement that appears in the Inflation Reduction Act. And as you read through the response, you'll see that we quote the Inflation Reduction Act that requires that the EPA develop a reporting program that accurately reports what emissions are and bases that reporting on what in the Inflation Reduction Act is referred to as empirical data. And we cite the definition of empirical data that the EPA uses in the proposal. So if the EPA is to accurately estimate what the emissions are, it's important to understand what the characteristics of these emissions are. And in the report, the work group divided the emissions into 4 categories. These 4 categories appear in descriptions in the scientific literature. And they divide emissions into large emission rate events and smaller emission rate events. And then for each of those categories, there are routine emissions or emissions that are occurring by design or that are readily accounted for, and those that are unintended. And to briefly summarize what the report states is that for 3 of these categories, the emission reporting is improvements, reasonable progress towards improving the accuracy of emissions. But for a 4th category, the large unintended emission events, the work group concludes that there is great uncertainty and that there are more accurate approaches that could be used to go after estimating both the total and these large emission events. There's still a lot of uncertainty about exactly how important these emission events are. The scientific evidence that's summarized in the report indicates that in some areas, they may be the dominant emission events. In other areas, other regions of the country, they may be a relatively small fraction. So highly heterogeneous, but if you attempted to do an average over the entire country, these large emission events would be a significant fraction of what the total emissions are. Hence, to get an accurate estimate of the emissions, these need to be estimated accurately. So the finding that appears in the report summarizes what I've just stated, that there are these different categories of emission events, and that to accurately estimate emissions as is called for in the Inflation Reduction Act, all 4 of these categories need to be estimated properly as well as the total, and that there are more accurate methods that that could be used. So what the board is recommending then is that the EPA use an approach that begins with doing basin-wide measurements. The reason for using basin-wide measurements is that these large unintended emission events are relatively rare. And because they're relatively rare, if you're going out and doing periodic surveys for them, you're going to miss many of them if you're going site by site, attempting to individually, site by site, through periodic surveys, identify these emission events. You will miss some. And then the work group also found that the approaches that are used for estimating how long these emission events might last, which is also important for reporting what the quantities emitted are, might overstate what the length of the emission events are. So for that reason, the work group recommended that what be done is to develop basin-wide totals, region-wide totals for these emissions. And the reason why that will be an improvement is because you're simultaneously making measurements. Then if you're getting a production basin total or a region-wide total, you're getting a total over potentially thousands of different sites, and hence have the ability to capture many of these large, relatively infrequent events. So we're recommending that the agency may undertake these basin-wide measurements and compare those to the reporting that is done through the GHGRP. And that will provide an independent assessment of the accuracy and completeness of emissions reporting. We then recommend that, based on the comparison between reported emissions and basin level observations, that the facility level reporting might need to be adjusted, and the procedures for refining that or developing that adjustment would require input from a broad range of stakeholders, and we describe some of potential approaches. So that was the first question, dealing with the accuracy of the reporting. Second question dealt then with the question of defining these large emission events. So if you're breaking the categories of emissions into small emission rate events and large emission rate events, how do you define that boundary? And the proposal from the EPA is to use two potential definitions, and we're recommending that one of those be eliminated. The two potential definitions that are proposed are an emission rate, an observed instantaneous emission rate of 100 kilograms an hour. So to put that emission rate in context, a representative oil and gas production site might have an emission rate that is on the order of 1 kilogram an hour or lower. So this is a couple of orders of magnitude greater than typical emission rates that are observed. The board had previously commented on this in the methane rule, which also proposed this emission rate threshold of 100 kilograms an hour for its super emitters. We're supportive of the 100 kilogram an hour definition. However, the EPA in the GHGRP reporting proposal also includes an absolute magnitude of 250 tons of carbon dioxide emitted. And that's 250 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's approximately 10 tons of methane using a global warming potential of either 25 or 28 as EPA uses in its reporting. So about 10 tons of CO2. That would mean that EPA would be defining a large emission rate to include not only events that have emission rates perhaps 2 orders of magnitude greater than a typical emission rate, but also emissions that might persist for 6 months that might only be 2 kilograms an hour. And so we propose that they eliminate this 250 tons of CO2 equivalent as a threshold and concentrate on the emission rate threshold. So that was the second question and response. The third question was, are there additional data that the EPA should consider in reporting through the GHGRP or additional data collection? And what we're recommending is information about the compositions of emissions that are emitted that include methane. And so other species could include hazardous air pollutants, could include volatile organic compounds. These can be substantial. Information about these other species that are co-emitted with methane could be highly useful in source attribution, giving chemical fingerprints of various emission sources, but also be extremely valuable in environmental justice analyses. So we recommended that EPA also collect data on the compositions of the emissions associated with the methane emissions reported through the GHGRP. So those were the 3 questions and a brief summary of our responses. Let me turn it to Steve Hamburg to see if he wants to add anything. So Steve, over to you.
Thanks, Dave. I'm going to be trying to be brief here. First, I just want to, Dave had a slight misstatement that he didn't mean, which was it's 10 tons of methane, which is equivalent to 250 of CO2. So just want to make clear, I think most people got that, but I just wanted to make sure that that was clear. And I do want to stress one of the things that's really quite different about this is, and Dave said it, but I think it's really important to put it in context. This is the first time that by law for a greenhouse gas, it's requiring that it be using empirical data and it be accurate. And that's important because not only is it the reporting has large fiscal implications because the fee is assessed against the reporting above a specified threshold in the law. So this is a law, this isn't a regulation, it's mandated. This is the implementation of the law. So that first section is really important that Dave described. And that to be accurate, it really needs to be independent. And the place that we commented on is because it really didn't fully go there in the proposed regulations to get to the assessment of accuracy. So what we tried to suggest was a straightforward way of providing that. The proposed implementation of the law does ask for comments about doing the basin level. And so we directly took that on, and I think that's an important point. It's also an important point that this is work that is in the scientific literature. It has been done. There have been cases where it's been flown many times in the same area to understand the variability. And just to stress that a little more, I just stress the reason why that works is because there's a lot of ephemeral events. So things that happen but last, as Dave implied, for short periods of time and varying periods of time. But it's when you do it as a larger area, they've been demonstrated to even out because things turning on and off in the aggregate tends to give you a much tighter estimate. The more that you look at it at an individual site basis, the more uncertainty you have, which then challenges your ability to be accurate. So the key here is, how do you meet that accuracy requirement using empirical data? And the criticality of empirical data here is that the whole purpose of the underlying fee, and as the rule that I hear from the grapevine be released in the next couple of days, is to try and reduce those emissions, which means you need to have a system of reporting that's very temporally responsive, so that if you do get the actions you want, the fees will be reflecting those changes in emissions and hopefully their reductions as per the desire. The key here is to try and be sure that we pick up the dynamics of what's going on. The maybe one thing I would just comment a little bit in terms of Dave's comments about the three categories, the intended larger events and the two smaller events, types of events, the intended and unintended, has quite a bit of uncertainty with it as well. So it's not just the larger events. They tend to add up more quickly, but that's the reason for doing the overall basin level and getting at this accuracy, because you do have and to get empirical data across that. I'm just trying to see if there's anything else I wrote down. Yeah, I think I will stop with that and just maybe just emphasize this this duration issue at the individual site level is a serious challenge. Is the ability to understand how long something happens in an individual site is something that's pushing the bounds of the science. We can do it in the aggregate area quite accurately. That's been demonstrated in numerous papers. But when you're trying to map it for every site, and there's a difference here, one thing just for everybody's edification is it's the way the GHGRP is structured. A facility, when it comes to production sites, is not the individual site, it's the collection of all the sites that a company owns. So that can be hundreds, if not thousands, depends on the size of I mean, it could be a few, but overwhelmingly it represents large numbers. So the requirement is that you aggregate all that data, and it's not about the individual site of production, unlike for a processing plant or compressor station where it's the individual site that is represented by a facility. That's a nuance, but it really makes a difference with respect to how you meet the requirement of an accurate reporting program based on empirical data. With that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hamburg. If you and Dr. Allen have no other comments, I would like to ask for any other comments on this draft report from members of the SAB and our board liaisons. If you all have any comments or questions, could you please raise your electronic hand so we can recognize you? Okay. All right, Dr. Rodewald.
Great, thanks a lot. And really nice job on the report by the committee. I really appreciate the work that everyone's done. My comments are more related to just the way some of the information is presented. And when I was reading the report, my interpretation from the introduction was that one of the chief concerns were that protocols needed to be revised because a lot of the unintended emissions were not sufficiently captured, because it said that the anticipated emissions were captured well. And so I thought that a lot of the recommendations that came later from that didn't really discern clearly, at least for me, being admittedly this is not my area of expertise. I wasn't clear if they were addressing more the anticipated emissions or the unintended emissions. So that was one of the recommendations. So that would be maybe just clearly either changing the introduction so it doesn't maybe land so much as unintended emissions are the problem, and then those aren't really specifically mentioned later, or maybe putting a finer point on those comments later. And I thought too that the maybe in some of the recommendations, just talking a little bit more about why some of the approaches, like the basin-wide measurements, how those would actually better ensure capturing those unintended emissions. And so like just some detail about the percent of time that might be captured by those, because my understanding is that they're still sampling certain time periods or certain days. So that would be just maybe a sentence or a little bit more detail there. But otherwise, I thought it was a great report. So yeah, thanks again to the committee.
Thank you so much. Dr. Cobb?
Yes, thank you. I have a question, and first of all, I apologize for not having gotten to read the report in its entirety. I know there's a lot of work going into these. I have a question about the basin-wide total. That would be an assemblage of measurements from several measuring points. That's question number one. And question number two, then would there be modeling to try to figure out where hotspots might be to pinpoint potential high emitters?
So I want Drs. Allen or Hamburg.
Yeah, I can go ahead and begin both in responding to Dr. Cobb and also to Dr. Rodewald. And then let me turn it back to Steve. So first, let me talk to Dr. Cobb's question about how these basin-wide total emission measurements might be done. And the simple answer is in multiple ways. And so there are multiple ways to get at a basin-wide total. And let me just give you 3 examples of how this has been done in the literature. And we can expand on this in the report and give examples of how this might be done. So 3 potential ways. There's some others. One is you get a satellite measurement looking at concentrations highly resolved in an individual basin, and you're getting snapshots, and those snapshots might be as frequently as daily, for example. All right. And through various types of satellite inversion calculations, you can get a total emission flux based on that. Second approach is to fly an airplane that might have, for example, a downward looking LiDAR instrument that would measure all the concentrations underneath the aircraft. So you fly it above the boundary layer and look underneath it, get all the emissions coming into the region, then fly down to the other end of the region and measure everything going out, and do that on a mass balance basis. What went in, what came out, that's what difference is what got added. And so that's a mass balance flight, routinely done. Third way of going about doing it is using fixed towers that are permanently placed in various regions. Often towers wouldn't need to be towers, could also be ground sensors, but permanently placed sensors around the boundaries of regions or within regions that can also get at these. So multiple ways of doing it. We didn't want to go into all those details and suggest particular ways of doing this, but we can certainly expand and give examples and based on that, give a better sense of what these basin-wide totals are, and that they've been supported in the scientific literature and demonstrated in scientific literature. So that's how those might be done.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
let me maybe briefly pause before I turn to Amanda's questions and see if you had any follow-up on that.
No, that's a perfect explanation, and that's kind of what I was envisioning. But again, I did not get a chance to read the whole report, and your explanation is very good. And we're both in Texas, so we face some of the same issues here with the air quality in various locations. So thank you very much.
Let me, though, jump in just to add one other point to your comment. This would not necessarily, depending on the techniques as Dave described, tell you where the large emitting sources would be within that. It may or may not. It depends on the size and it depends on the techniques. So there are various mass balance approaches that wouldn't. There's some that would. There's some, I mean, it depends. But that's not critical, because in the case of the basin, what you're trying to do is constrain the overall emissions to get at the question of accuracy. So the goal is to know how much in aggregate, not where it's coming from. And then you can test it against your other measurements, your more, I'll call them bottom up. They don't have to be exactly technically bottom up. They could be smaller scale, site level, but that allows you to test it. So you have two independent sets of data. You can test the accuracy then in that way directly, but it would not inherently meet the elemental components described. And it doesn't have to be. It just says that all the pieces add up to the whole.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. And the reason, part of the reason for the question is we're dealing with lots of issues of airborne contaminants in the SACC, and trying to figure out how to assess those for hazards. So this kind of approach is very germane to what we're tackling in our committee. So thank you very much.
And let me turn to Dr. Rodewald's question, which is sort of the different ways of describing these different types of emissions and the levels of uncertainty associated with that. And I think we can address your comment with some clarifying language. But I think the reason why it may have been a bit obscure, and perhaps we're a little too close to the issue at times to write really clearly for an external audience. But one of the things the EPA is doing in the current proposal for the GHGRP is mandating very large numbers of measurements, new measurements that would be made on some of these other categories of emissions. So while I completely agree with the comment that Steve made earlier that currently we still have large uncertainties in many of these, the EPA is proposing in the current proposal to require measurements on an ongoing basis directly on the sources on virtually every site on a rotating basis to make measurements of these. So while we might expect that if the proposal as written were implemented, that these other categories would improve, not so for the way the proposal is currently written for the large unintended emissions. And I think we can make that a lot clearer.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments from the board? All right, seeing no electronic hands, I do want to once again thank you, Dr. Allen and Dr. Hamburg, for making such clear, very helpful recommendations on a short time frame. So thank you so much. I want to thank the board for your discussion. I think it was helpful. So I want to now request a motion regarding the disposition of this draft report. We can decide to approve the report as is, approve it with the revisions that we discussed today, or not approve or disapprove the draft report. So I will now ask for a motion and a second for disposition of this report.
Well, I would move that we approve the report with revisions to be approved by the chair as per the discussion in the last few minutes.
I'll second that.
Thank you. It's been moved and seconded. I think we would send this back, and I'll ask Tom for clarification if this is wrong. I think once we incorporate the changes, I can work with the chairs to incorporate the changes, but I think we might send this back for concurrence before submitting it to the administrator. But Tom can correct me if I'm wrong. But with that motion, I think the motion is still good just put the changes. Go ahead, Tom.
Well, I don't think it's required that we go that route where we send it back for approval. Based on this discussion, that's an option. Another option is that you got what you needed from this conversation, you got the comments you need, and you can incorporate it and move forward.
Good. Okay. So thank you for that clarification. So we don't have to come back. So great. So the motion stands as is, that we update with the changes, and I will work with the chairs on it and we can move it forward. So I would like to call a voice vote again. So all those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
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 All those opposed? Any abstentions? All right, thank you, everyone. That sounds like it was unanimous. Thank you all for, once again, for your hard work in drafting this report, and also for your great discussion. Dr. Hamburg, did you have a question?
I just wanted one thing that didn't get said that I think should be called out. I just want to call out Dr. Bond. If it read well and was comprehensible, I want to give her a lot of credit for helping Dr. Allen and myself translate our inside baseball into a more generalizable and easily understood sentences. And so I just wanted to make that mention, because she worked really hard to unpack some of the writing that both of us did.
So noted, and thank you so much.
That's very kind.
Yep. Thank you so much for acknowledging her work. All right, so now we will discuss our almost our last agenda item, and that is discussion of the recommendations received from the SAB work group for review of science supporting EPA decisions, otherwise known as the SSD work group. So first, I want to briefly review the process we follow for determining whether the SAB conducts reviews of the adequacy of the scientific and technical basis of planned EPA regulatory actions. So the Environmental Research Development and Demonstration Authorization Act of 1978, or ERDA, requires the EPA to make available to the SAB proposed criteria, documents, standards, limitations, or regulations provided to any other federal agency for formal review and comment, together with relevant scientific and technical information on which the proposed actions are based. The SAB may then make available to the administrator within the time specified by the administrator its advice and any comments on the adequacy of the scientific and technical basis of the proposed actions. So to fulfill these requirements, the EPA and SAB follow a process that includes the following 4 elements. 1, the EPA submits to the SAB staff office information regarding planned actions in the agency's semi-annual regulatory agenda expected to undergo interagency review. Then the EPA transmits to the SAB staff office all proposed actions that are sent to the Office of Management and Budget for interagency review, as well as the relevant supporting scientific and technical information. Then the SAB work group for the review of science supporting EPA decisions holds monthly meetings to examine planned actions sent to the SAB office, receive information about planned actions from the agency, identify aspects, if any, of planned actions that may warrant review by the full SAB. Then the work group prepares a report to the full SAB with recommendations for or against peer review for each planned action. And then the chartered SAB hosts public meetings to decide whether to undertake SAB peer reviews recommended by the work group. The SSD work group consists of myself, David Allen, Barbara Beck, Veronica Baracal, Jay Chakraborty, Stephen Hamburg, Celine Hernandez Ruiz, Sheila Olmstead, Jonathan Samet, Peter Thorne, Godfrey Uzochukwu, and June Weintraub. The work group met on September 29th and October 27th to discuss the adequacy of the scientific and technical bases supporting planned EPA regulatory action. The work group developed recommendations concerning SAB review of 2 planned regulatory actions. These actions are listed and discussed in the November 1, 2023 memorandum for the work group to the full SAB. The memo is also posted on the SAB website and materials for this meeting. So as indicated in the memo, the work group found that no further SAB review of these 2 planned EPA actions are warranted. So I would now like the board to decide whether it agrees with the work group's recommendations. So before we discuss the recommendations, I want to pause and ask the board members if they have any questions about the overall process. I do not see any hands. Okay. So with that, I will go to the first planned EPA action. I want to explain those a little bit. The first planned EPA action to be discussed is review of the final rule reclassification of major sources as area sources under Section 112 of the Clean Air Act. So the SAB work group found that further review of the supporting science by the chartered SAB is not warranted because the EPA has neither developed nor relied on new science for this rulemaking effort. So the EPA is proposing to add requirements to reclassify major sources to area sources under the National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants Program. So the EPA indicated that these requirements will assure that reclassifications do not undermine the individual Clean Air Act Section 112 emission standards established to reduce emissions of hazardous air pollutants from major sources or the broader aim of Clean Air Act Section 112 to achieve lasting emissions reductions across a wide range of industries to protect public health and the environment. So major sources emit or have the potential to emit 10 tons per year or more of a single HAP or 25 tons per year of or more of a combination of HAPs. Area sources emit HAP at levels below these thresholds. The EPA has indicated that the proposed amendments will provide greater clarity to regulated sources and state permitting authorities regarding the criteria needed for NESHAP reclassifications to include enforceable requirements that assure ongoing demonstrable compliance. So since there's no science, we did not recommend an action. So now I'd like to call for a motion and any necessary discussion to approve or disapprove the work group's recommendation on such action. So first, I would like to call for a motion and a second. And again, the recommendation.
To approve the work group's motion.
Was that Dr. Fordham?
I second. Yes.
It's been moved and seconded. Thank you. Any discussion? Do not see hands. So all those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
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 All those opposed? Any opposition? Sorry. Any abstentions? Excellent. The motion passed. Thank you all so much. The second planned action to be discussed is titled National Primary Drinking Water Regulations for Lead and Copper Improvements. So the SAB work group found that this planned action does not warrant review by the chartered SAB because it does not rely on new scientific approaches. The SAB previously reviewed EPA's drinking water regulations for lead and copper. So in June 2020, the SAB provided advice to EPA on a proposed drinking water rule for lead and copper promulgated in 2021. Then in November 2022, the SAB conducted a consultation with EPA's Office of Water on environmental justice analyses for the agency's lead and copper rule improvements. After the EPA promulgated the National Primary Drinking Water Rule for lead and copper in 2021, the agency reviewed the rule and concluded that there were significant opportunities to improve the lead and copper regulations. Priority improvements identified by the EPA included proactive and equitable lead service line replacement, strengthening compliance tap sampling requirements to better identify communities most at risk of lead in drinking water, and reducing complexity and confusion associated with action and trigger levels. So the EPA, it's important to say the EPA continues to recognize there's no safe level of lead exposure. The SAB work group found there are no new scientific elements supporting the National Primary Drinking Water Regulations for lead and copper improvements. Therefore, the work group does not recommend SAB review of the planned action. So at this time, I would like to call for a motion, a second, and then we'll have a discussion to approve or disapprove the work group's recommendation.
I move to approve the recommendation.
Thank you, Dr. Browder.
Second.
I second.
Thank you. Who was that second?
Yeah, this is me.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, both.
Couple seconds. We'll attribute it to Dr. Chin. All right. So we have a move, second. All those in favor of the motion?
Aye.
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 Anyone opposed? Is that an opposite? Dr. Beck, is your hand up for?
It's not an opposite. I just wanted to make a comment after
Okay.
this regarding what EPA had provided to us.
Thank you. Any abstentions? All right, Dr. Beck, do you have a discussion?
Yeah, I just want to give a shout out to EPA for the excellent presentation they gave us on the copper rule. And then we had a question on how this related to public schools. And they gave a really quick and accurate response. Basically, school systems were not covered under the rules. I just want to thank EPA for their first presentation and for their responsiveness to our questions.
Thank you for making that comment. And it's important. I think when I was on a science advisory board before was when we first started this process. And I do remember it was quite rocky at first. So I'm really happy to hear that, you know, this is really going well right now. So thank you. And I appreciate you making that comment. So the motion passed. So we now have time on our agenda. We're well ahead of time by about an hour. So we now have time on the agenda to hear brief clarifying comments from EPA and members of the public. So I'll ask the DFO to whether there have been any requests to speak for this meeting. And if we do have requests, we'll call the speakers and ask them to provide short comments of no more than 2 to 3 minutes. Have there been?
Thank you. I just wanted to note that we have not had any requests for clarifying comments for this meeting.
Thank you so much. So hearing that, I would now like to just really thank the members of the Chartered SAB for participating in a very productive meeting. It's been a pleasure to meet today. The only thing I would change is I wish we were in person, but this was a really, really productive meeting. We got a lot done. So I will review our follow-up items and next steps. First, I'll work with Dr. Shindell to move the BIM-MAP and benefits methods report to be finalized to incorporate the comments that we heard at this meeting. For the SAB report on a greenhouse gas reporting rule, similarly, I will work to finalize that report with the chairs. And lastly, no action on SSD. So are there any additional questions from the board members today?
Yes, I have a question for Tom Brennan. Tom, I know we have some new board members because I'm seeing some new faces. Can you please let us know who they are?
Well, why don't we pull up the participant list and see who's still here, and we'll run through them one at a time. So first we have, of course, our chair, who's been leading us all day today. I think we also have Doug Wolf, who's still here right now. Doug, do you want to say hello?
Hello.
And John DiGiovanni, sorry, I mispronounced that. John, do you want to say hello?
Hello.
Dr. Rebecca Fry is here today.
Hi, everyone.
And Dr. Veronica Baracol is here today.
Hi.
And let me see if we have a couple. Not every single new person is here right now, but let me see who else. Well, I'm scrolling through the list. Did I miss anyone as I looked through the list? Is any of the other of the new folks still on? Dr. Zhu. Yeah, I see Dr. Zhu. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for being here. And we have a couple others that weren't able to make it. And we have one person that's not got quite their paperwork finalized to be an official SGE. But as we move forward, we'll have a couple more people joining us. And thank you, Dr. Rizzo, for giving me the opening to say it is always to reiterate. It's hard when people leave. It's always exciting when new people came on to the board and to our panels. And I'm just so excited to have you all here. And Dr. Jones, thank you for leading us in this initial meeting of your tenure. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. And I
Yeah,
will say,
sure.
it's been a pleasure preparing for this meeting. The EPA staff and DFO just so excellent in getting me up to speed really quickly. I wasn't onboarded, I think, formally until Monday. So it's been a quick week, but they were so excellent in making sure I was prepared for this meeting. So I do want to just thank the SAB staff for all the work that you do. It's so much appreciated. So if there are no other questions or comments, I'd like to ask the DFO to adjourn the meeting.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for participating today. And with that, I will adjourn.
Oh, well, sorry, there was one question about when our next meeting will be. I'm not sure if we know yet, but that was a question in the chat.
We do have some plans for a meeting. We still have one report that's in final stages. It's on the CastNet. Then Dr. Uzo is our chair of that one, and we're making great progress. We don't have a meeting date that we're able to announce to the public yet, but I will say that we're doing well on that. So I would expect a wintertime meeting on that one, and we'll dial it in when we check for availability and see who's around and what dates work best.
All right, thank you. So now again, I'll ask the DFO to formally adjourn.
Thank you all very much. And we'll adjourn today's meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Everyone.
Thank you.